Hey guys, Randall Carlson's latest science is coming up in about 10 seconds, but I wanted to take a moment to remind you that a channel with multiple Navy SEALs who are pro-cannabis and pro-psychedelics is probably not going to get a whole lot of love from the algorithms that share our content in the suggested video sidebar. So if you could take a moment to click like, share, and subscribe, that would be amazing, and it would help us continue to deliver this awesome content moving into the future. That's it. Thanks. Here's Randall. Hey, welcome to Two Seals and a Walrus, the only show that has two United States Navy SEALs as co-hosts. I am your co-host, Sean Webb, and to my right, we have United States Navy SEAL Sniper Medic Ben Johnson, and to his right, we have United States Navy SEAL Sniper Doug Moulton. Today, we have an amazing guest with us, Randall Carlson from Atlanta, Georgia. And he's joining us from his home office, where he's going to be firing up a new podcast of his own to present the cool science that he's been talking about on many podcasts, including Joe Rogan. How many times have you been on Joe Rogan, by the way? Aren't you a record?
Might be. It's 5 times now, probably 6 by early next year.
Wow. That's awesome. So you got another show planned to keep him up to date on what's coming up?
Yeah, we're talking about February.
Wow, that's great. So is it just going to be you, or because you've been on a couple of times with Graham Hancock too, right?
I have, yeah. I think it'll probably be just me this time.
Well, you are a wealth of information on your specialty, which is kind of, putting the big picture together on a number of sciences that tell a story that isn't in mainstream media, certainly. And let's, see if we can't. I've got a few notes here to bring everybody up to speed of what you've been working on, and then we can kind of take off from there, because one of the reasons that we wanted to have you on is to talk about your path of being this guy who raises the flag first, and in the face of dogmatic science that wants to poo-poo everything that you're talking about, yet you've been a stalwart in standing your ground and showing the evidence to tell the story that we may all be wrong on our humanity origin story, and what that might mean for humanity moving forward and how we might be able to use that. And we'll get into that shortly, but let's sum this up for some folks. And you stop me if I make any errors here, but there is conclusive evidence of a mass extinction event which took out half of the megafauna, which are the large animals of the earth, about 12 to 13,000 years ago, with animals literally being killed with undigested food in their stomachs. And then this evidence coincides with other evidence of a high heat, high energy atmospheric event, which happened globally across the planet, which then also coincides with other evidence of a dramatic climate change in Earth's atmosphere, which melted thousands of trillions of tons of water from numerous ice caps and ended the ice age called the Younger Dryas, which then, of course, and this is supported by evidence, caused mass flooding events, both globally and domestically, which then resulted in a 400-foot or so rise in sea levels. And by the way, point to me one religion which doesn't speak of great floods in their storytelling.
Right.
But this hundreds of feet in sea rise would certainly most definitely have covered any coastal population centers by hundreds of miles of ocean, which would have then been, a tsunami, which would have been traveling at thousands of miles per hour, potentially, depending on if we had a celestial event that dropped a comet on us that would pulverize any existing civilization evidence, which, by the way, all this coincides with Plato's dating of the sinking of an advanced technology population called Atlantis. And so all of this evidence suggests that we as a civilization may have to rewrite our entire origin story for humanity, because our human brains have been about the same size for 150,000 to 200,000 years. And so there may indeed have been an advanced human civilization that was wiped out by some celestial bodies smacking into the earth, which could easily explain all the mounting evidence that something happened a little over 10,000 years ago that almost wiped out all life on the planet, including humans, after which the folks who survived the event eventually crawled out of the desert and created the bidet, which is, I think, the single largest awesome invention of humanity, to be able to spray water on our butts and take the poop off without toilet paper. How am I doing so far?
You're pretty close there, Sean, but one thing we need to clarify after you're talking about wet butts is that it's pronounced younger dryas, not younger dry ass. Okay?
We don't necessarily have to go into the speculation that the Athenians that kicked the Atlanteans' ass were potentially aliens, and maybe they influenced the comets into the Earth to sink Atlantis. Who knows what could be going on there? But how's that for a good summation?
You were pretty right on for a lot of it. I mean, obviously, we need to clarify some things. 400-foot sea level rise, but it was not instantaneous. It was essentially spread out over about 5,000 or 6,000 years. Although within that span of time, I think we can identify 3 specific pulses of sea level rise. In fact, the first pulse of sea level rise appears to have now is dated at about 14,600 years ago. The second one at about 12,900, which coincides with the onset of the Younger Dryas and the main pulse of mass extinction of the megafauna. And you were right about that. There was about half of all the species on Earth that weigh more than 44 kilograms, which is about 100 pounds in body weight, did go extinct. Most of that extinction occurred right around 12,800 to 12,900 years ago, which is what in geological terms would be called the Balling-Allerode Younger Dryas transition. The Balling-Allerode was 2 climate stages where the planet began to sort of a natural gradual warming near the end of the Ice Age. And then at 12,900 years ago, there was a sudden event that reversed 2,000 to 3,000 years of gradual warming and shot the planet back into about a 1,300-year cold snap that then rapidly ameliorated around 11,600 years ago, which is the date that coincides with Plato's date as given in his 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, when he talks about the destruction of the Atlantean civilization 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile into Egypt, which is dated about 600 BC. So if you do the math on that, you'll come up with about 11,600. And that is the date now that's given for the onset of the Holocene Epoch, which is the one that we find ourselves in at present, which is the post-glacial epoch. And essentially what happened was that between 11,600 and about 12,900 is the planet went through a whole series of convulsive changes that completely altered the global landscape. And what came out of that was a very different world, and that's the world that we have inhabited.
Now, all this evidence has been accumulating, and as we increase our technology, it only sharpens the picture that, this is going to be correct and probably accepted science pretty soon, even though you've had a large number of detractors try to step up and say, no, it all happened gradually, all these changes, the extinction event and, all the killing of the mammoths happened when the hunter-gatherers came across and killed them all for absolutely no reason, etc. But you were the original person who put all this together and started this theory a long time ago, and the whole time you've had to stand firm in your understanding, your belief, your vision of how all this comes together, and you've had to kind of resist the existing dogmatic science that would try to dismiss it the whole time. Is that correct?
It's close. It's really, so much of what I was doing in the early days was in total obscurity. So nobody knew I was doing this research other than small groups. I started giving classes and lectures on this in the early 1980s. And it was during, I got into this path really pretty much heavily in the 1970s after spending a lot of time backpacking and camping and hiking in the various in Western states and becoming really obsessively interested in geology. But, and then I was also interested in a lot of things, I've always been that way. I've been very interested in a diverse array of things. I've always been obsessively curious about the world that we live in. And so, I was interested in ancient history. And a lot of these things began to really come together in the 80s and the 90s. But, because I was laboring in obscurity, I wasn't really attacked too much until I really started coming public with this stuff maybe 10 years ago. But, I don't really think that I've been unfairly treated. I mean, the way science works is it's like, you propose a radical theory, you're going to expect that you're going to get attacked, and you got to go through the whole process. And when the dust settles, you see who's the last man standing. And I try to vet everything that I get into. I regularly, other people watch television or, attend sports events. I basically study scientific literature because that's what turns me on.
You're a sick man.
I am. I'm truly
disgusting.
Disgusting, demented, deranged. Let's not forget that.
You're in good company. Well, we wanted to have you on our show because, the three of us are kind of in the same boat that you are in our different verticals. And the two guys over here on the couch, Ben and Doug, have both gone through, obviously, special forces experiences, and they've had to deal with issues of PTSD and other things that they've dealt with, and are now in the boat of being kind of pro-cannabis and pro-psychedelics, which is tough to be in that boat as, a former military individual, and especially, a Navy SEAL, to come out and say, hey, we may need to look at this stuff from a scientific perspective on how it might be able to help our returning veterans and how it might be able to help humanity in general. And does it make sense for us to keep these substances as, Schedule I classified substances that you can't ever touch it or you go to jail type of thing. And then I've also been in that kind of boat where I've done this work on emotional intelligence and defining emotions logically, et cetera, and have found a bit of resistance in that scientific realm as well. People saying, "Oh, you can't define emotions logically. You can't teach emotions to computers and emotional analysis of human minds through computing and stuff like that." And so we wanted to have you on because you've been right from the beginning and you've stayed your course, and we really are gaining a large benefit from that because we may be able to rewrite the human origin story that we've been told from the time we were kids. And if that helps us get over some of the stories that we've been told about, not necessarily that, you don't want to poo-poo the idea of God, and none of us here in this studio would do that. But at the same time, if there are particular religious stories that may be dividing people, and having us understand the larger picture of where those stories might have come from and the reality that might have existed before the Garden of Eden story had been told or whatever it was, that might bring us together as a people. And we wanted to have you on as the person who stands in the face of the folks who are resisting you to say, no, let's follow the evidence on this. Let's be pragmatic. Let's certainly question it. Let's be skeptical about our own assumptions. But at the same time, we got to be ready to release the old ideas of what we believed yesterday so that we can move forward and become a better, more intelligent, more knowledgeable race of people and individuals.
Exactly. And yeah, we are in a time of tremendous ferment right now in terms of understanding our own past. And there are dogmas that have been entrenched since the 19th century. And old dogmas don't let go easily.
No.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what was one of the times that you found that in your career? Like, you started laying this out about 10 years ago. What are some of the examples of the folks who have stood up and said, no, for absolutely no good reason? We don't have to throw an individual under the bus, but what are the
well, we can mention a few names, but
who's the biggest piece of shit you've ever talked to? and where does he live?
No, what kind of resistance have you had from the dogmatic science community?
Well, more, again, like I said, in the last decade or so, since I've been putting more stuff out there. But you know what? I relish getting challenged because, I've done my homework, and I don't claim to be 100% correct about everything because I'm not. Nobody is.
You'd be an insane person.
Yeah. I have a pretty good grasp of the scientific literature around the subject matter that I'm interested in, and I've done a lot of work in the field, and I've spent a lot of time out in the field with professionals who are considered to be some of the top in their field. And, I've discovered something interesting. Publicly, a lot of them will have one stance, but when you talk to them off on the side, they'll admit, yeah, we don't really have it all figured out. And yeah, maybe there is another angle to this whole thing. And that's the thing I've kind of discovered over and over again, that there are holes, very, very distinct holes within these prevailing dogmas. And, I have been, interesting, the last time I was on Rogan, talking about a lot of this. I'll give you an example. Two geologists. I was talking about the work of the late John Shaw, who is a Canadian geologist who has done tremendous work on deciphering drumlin fields, drumlin swarms, which is something we can talk about shortly because that's one of my latest passions is drumlins. But so he had a new interpretation of drumlins, which totally consistent with the idea of a major catastrophic upheaval at the end of the last ice age. His work was pretty much rejected by mainstream geological community for various reasons, only because the scale of what he was describing was so vast that nobody really wanted to wrap their heads around it. Because in Earth history, basically, the geological science the cornerstone of modern geological science has been uniformitarianism, which is that everything happens sort of gradually, incrementally, and it all has its modern counterparts. And so it's unscientific to invoke processes or scales or severity of events that are unlike anything that we've experienced since science was invented a couple of centuries ago.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Done.
The problem is, see, the uniformity principle is a very powerful diagnostic tool for understanding what happened. But it can also show us that, clearly there's this body of evidence that cannot be explained by reference to modern processes, right?
Right.
And so, anyways, after several episodes on Joe Rogan, one of the geologists that I'd actually been out in the field with on at least one occasion went online and called me a charlatan, right? He didn't back up anything. He didn't refute anything that I'd ever said. He just basically, the straw man argument. Basically, he created something that he, claimed that I was saying, which I was not. But then at the same time, another geologist who was a co-author of a seminal paper with John Shaw, who is one of the leading experts on drumlins in the world, contacted me and invited me out in the field with him. And so basically I went and spent 4 days in the field with him up in the drumlin swarms of central British Columbia. And so by contrast, we have two geologists, both part of the mainstream community. One of them calls me a charlatan. One of them says, "You're onto something, man. Come here. I want to show you something because it supports what you're onto."
Right.
But it's interesting. I've noticed in some of these controversies, like, for example, in terms of the great flooding that occurred at the end of the last ice age, there's one interpretation that I kind of consider to be the sort of the American interpretation. And it's mostly geologists with the U.S. Geological Survey. And they have a model, right? And this model has been pretty much entrenched since the 1940s and 1950s. The Canadian geologists, of which John Shaw was one, have come up with an alternate model. And this alternate, so there, in a way, there's almost this conflict now between American geologists and Canadian geologists. And the Canadian geologists, I'm afraid, are right in this case. And I've spent a lot of time in Canada looking at the evidence up there that, when we're talking about the glacial meltdown, and the old idea is you would assume that glaciers are melting from their margins receding back, just as exactly as we have seen in the last 2 centuries with the diminishing size of modern glaciers, which are basically little ice age glaciers. And it's important to point out that this little ice age, which was roughly 1400 to 1850, is like the coldest 400 years of the entire Holocene of the last 10 or 11,000 years. It's the coldest. And the glaciers during the little ice age grew to their largest extent in over 10,000 years since the end of the great ice age. So when we start talking about glacier recession, it's important to realize that, well, our baseline, we're talking about glaciers receding from their Holocene maximum, which is bigger than they had been in literally 11 or 12,000 years. So the idea is when we see these glaciers receding over the last century or two, they basically, you can look at it, and I have lots of photographs where you see this. You look at them every few decades, and the margin of the glaciers are receding backwards. Essentially mountain glaciers are receding up valley. But when we go and we look at the melting at the end of the last ice age, you have to bear in mind that over half of North America was buried under this massive sheet of ice that was at least as big, probably bigger than that which now covers the South Pole. And when you start thinking about it, that's pretty phenomenal. If you go from the Atlantic to the Pacific and from the northern United States up to the Arctic Circle, and everything is buried under thousands of feet of ice. When we look at cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, Seattle, all of those cities were, of course, those areas were buried under thousands of feet of ice.
It's going to make it hard to get to work, right?
Yes, it would be tricky. So here's my point, is that now when we look at the way the glaciers disappeared, we're not really seeing glacial recession. I mean, that's part of the process, but we're also seeing these melting events, these epicenters of melting that are sometimes hundreds, even close to 1,000 miles up within the glacier mass itself.
Right.
The melting back of the ice sheets was as rapid on its northern perimeter as on its southern perimeter. And that makes no sense at all within the conventional explanations of deglaciation and what caused it.
Right. Drumlins,
going back to that, is the geomorphic form, the form in the landscape that I think is key to deciphering and mapping these melting epicenters. And how would you get a center of a catastrophic melting that, let's say, is 500 or 600 or 700 miles up within the ice mass itself? That doesn't make sense within the conventional models. And so we are definitely looking at something catastrophic. And when we're looking at the melting, some of these meltwater floods were just unbelievable in their scale. Just almost I've spent, thousands of hours out in the field, literally. And, I can go out there and travel, let's say, from Portland over to Western Montana, looking at this flooding phenomenon where it's very spectacularly preserved. And you can spend 2 weeks out there and you're only just beginning to get the bare parameters of this event. And because the scale of it is so extraordinary that, you just have a very difficult time wrapping your head around. And it's interesting, I think, that what we're looking at here is essentially a major trauma in Earth history. I think it's important, in some of the stuff that you're getting into, Sean, is to what extent, when you have somebody who basically sees they've survived an event that has wiped out their entire world. What is that doing to their consciousness? What is that doing to perpetual generations? Is there, and this is not something I've had the chance to really explore yet, but is there an imprint, a genetic imprint, some memory in our DNA that carries that trauma with us?
We have, so this is interesting. I know a little bit too much about this right now. So, I mean, we what you just described exists, and we know it exists. It's called epigenetics. So we know areas that, having gone to war and experienced really ravaged sections of this world. I mean, I've read all these studies, and this is, you look at these areas that have experienced war for the last 100, 200, 500,000 years. And what happens is we discovered, the study of that, they found that there's these epigenetics that are really influenced by our environment. And they found that areas like Syria, Afghanistan or Afghanistan that are just ravaged by war, it brings out these genetics, these epigenetics within people that are more, sadly and really sadly, more suited for war. So you get a higher percentage of sociopaths, you get a higher percentage of psychopaths, because that's the environment that goes on. It is a literal generational trauma. So I'm totally on board with your view of this. that it is in our DNA. Absolutely. And we know that now. I think the science is just kind of coming out showing, oh shit, our environment kind of fucks us up a little bit. And it's encoded in us.
Yeah, well, the science of genetic memory in mass, I mean, they've shown that if you shock a mouse in an environment that is, striped or whatever it is, and then you can have its grandchildren and great-grandchildren that have never been exposed to that same type of trauma put in the same environment that created the triggers for that trauma, and they freak out, even though they don't
know why.
Yeah, and they don't know why, but they themselves were not exposed to the trauma in the first place. They were simply the offspring of the mouse that had the trauma in the first place. And they've found this in tapeworms and things like that, 17 or 18 generations. So we know that the genetics can carry the message down from generation to generation. And so, I mean, all of this stuff pulls together, because when we're talking about
getting a core sample.
right, exactly. When we're talking about,
we have to go through the mind to do that.
Things that humanity has experienced generations back, those could be written into our existence right now, right? And so I think that makes this discussion especially poignant, because, as much as the multiple disciplines of science that you've pulled together, Randall, to be able to tell this one story about a catastrophic event, which, by the way, I mean, I noticed, like on the last conversation that you guys had with the talking about the elephant or the mammoth with the broken legs and the full tummy of undigested food and stuff like that. When you're talking about a traumatic celestial body coming in at thousands of miles per hour, of course, if it hits a big piece of ice, it's going to create a massive melting and a lot of heat, energy, etc. But it's also going to create an immense shock wave, because these guys sitting on the couch can tell you, ordnance goes off. The first thing that you feel is the shock wave connected with that through the atmosphere, and
the second thing you feel is the shock wave.
Yeah, and then the third thing is all the shit in your body rattling around.
So you've got this immense shock wave that could knock animals off their feet and of course kill them instantaneously, because there's only a certain amount of compression that the human brain or that any brain can withstand before simply ceasing. Like, people have accidentally shot themselves with blanks in the mouth and killed themselves, even though nothing was expelled from the weapon. The pressure itself created the sinus wave shock wave that basically ended their life because of the shock wave itself. But then, like you said, you were talking about the science of the great climate change, heating and then cooling again and then heating again. It's like, okay, this comet comes in, destroys the ice caps, creates all this flooding, but then the heat associated with that is going to warm the earth because of the energy that's released within the atmosphere itself. But then all of this stuff is thrown up into the atmosphere, blocking the sun, dropping ice water on everybody, basically, for a long period of time. It's going to cool off again before then not having the ice en masse to adjust the climate of the earth, and then we're going to warm up over time. Is that accurate?
That's pretty close. Yeah, the initial impact, literally the environment would have just been rendered chaotic. And there's emerging evidence of major global firestorms that came in the wake. I mean, the evidence of an impact now is quite robust.
Right.
And when it first was proposed by what I would consider more mainstream scientific community was 2007. I actually came upon the idea from reading Ignatius Donnelly, probably in the mid-1970s, who proposed, who made the cometary connection with the demise of Atlantis. So it's certainly not an original idea with me, but it was so considered on the fringe that nobody really even paid attention to it. Nobody even looked at it. So as the years went by and as I learned more and I realized, well, there's so many things that are going on with these global changes that really aren't explained, maybe we need to reconsider some of these, quote unquote, fringe ideas.
Right.
And as it turns out, the fringe ideas are really more close to the truth than the mainstream ideas of strict gradualism, because, most of the 20th century was a rejection of anything, that seemed catastrophic at all. And this goes back basically to the early controversies in geology, when the early first geologists were almost all catastrophists. a lot of the founders of geology were actually theologians. And, you know, they tended to cast their interpretations within the biblical framework. And
They were using what they had.
Yeah, they were using what they had. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they would look at evidence in the field and think, well, gosh, look at all these huge gravel deposits here. How did they get there? Well, must have been giant flood. Well, that's evidence of Noah's flood. And so that kind of became sort of the dominant idea in the 19th century, that you're looking at this evidence in the landscapes that suggests catastrophic flooding. And then as the 19th century gets on, you have a different school that arises, the Lyellian school, Charles Lyell, who took the work of James Hutton and Playfair and basically cast it into a dogma, which he called uniformitarianism. And this dogma became the fundamental cornerstone, if you will, of academic geology, because in the early to mid 19th century, geology was not an academic scientific discipline, and it only became that towards the end of the 19th century, where universities would actually begin to have geology departments and so on. When they did that, they basically took on a strict uniformitarian interpretation of Earth history, because being scientific, they were going to basically evolve past all the biblical stuff. And there was a component of biblical literalism. And, the idea amongst so many of the biblical literalists was the earth is, only 5,000 or 6,000 years old, which of course is not the case. But yeah. So all of this was kind of lumped together, and they thought, well, we're going to move beyond that. We're scientists. We're going to dispense with, biblical interpretations. And so anybody who came along and proposed, well, wait a minute, some of this evidence you're talking about, some of this evidence here really does look like it was created by huge floods. Well, they were ignored or dismissed. That's why when geologist J. Harlan Bretz came along in the early 1920s and proposed that the so-called channeled Scablands of eastern Washington were produced by gigantic floods, he was just dismissed out of hand, literally for a quarter of a century.
Was there a counter argument to how they were made, or was it just dismissed?
Yeah. Well, it was mostly dismissed, and the attempts to put out a counter argument basically attempted to explain it in terms as a result of more gradual, prolonged processes. But Bretz was very, very dogged in his field research, and he spent a couple of decades exhaustively documenting the evidence. And when you pull it all together, it doesn't give much room for any other interpretation other than gigantic catastrophic floods. And one of his preeminent critics was a geologist named James Coulee. And James Coulee sort of spearheaded the effort to discredit Bretz. And there's a famous story about where James Coulee organized this conference in Washington, D.C. They invited Harlan Bretz, and the idea was that they were going to, ostensibly give him a fair hearing. But what it really was an assassination attempt. They were basically going to band together and suppress this heresy. And James Coulee was the geologist who essentially spearheaded this effort to once and for all, let's do away with this heresy of catastrophic flooding and all of its implications. So then what happened was, at that meeting, there was another geologist named J.T. Pardee, who was with the U.S. Geological Survey, and he had been studying mountain valleys in western Montana where he found evidence of gigantic masses of water. Well, that meeting was seminal because eventually J.T. Pardee's work and J. Harlan Bretz's work came together. And as we go along here, I can pull up some slides to show you the kind of things that Pardee was looking at. And see, and most of the critics, and I need to emphasize this, to a man, the critics of J. Harlan Bretz had never actually gone out in the field and seen this evidence firsthand, right?
Naturally.
Right.
Naturally.
Yeah, I saw it on Netflix.
Why is that such a common theme?
Finally, enough of them. And as time goes on, after 25 or 30 years, there was new generations of young geologists coming up who were a little bit more open to alternate interpretations. So eventually a field expedition was organized out to the Channel Scablands, and James Coulee was part of that. and they spent a week touring the region, and you're looking at a whole suite of these geological features like extinct cataracts, which I'll show you some photographs of here shortly.
Sure.
Gigantic boulders that were not, see, a lot of gigantic boulders had been found previously and associated with the ice mass, that the ice transported these with these erratic boulders. They're called erratic because it might be a boulder that is one composition, yet the bedrock there's a totally different kind of rock.
Like the ones you find in Maine, where I grew up.
Exactly, like the ones you find in Maine. But here was the problem. Here are these gigantic erratics that are 50, 100, 200 miles beyond the glacier margin. So they weren't deposited by the glaciers themselves. See, so you've got these coulees, which are these big sheer walled canyons. You've got these recessional cataracts. You've got the huge gravel deposits that form these gravel trains that might be 2 or 3 miles long. And rather than gravel like we think of, the composition of these things might be millions of boulders that are 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 feet, even 20 feet in diameter. You have fields of these gigantic current ripples. And again, we'll pull up some slides and look at this stuff. So it's like when you go in the field and you see this whole suite of stuff, isolated one particular thing, you might be able to explain it away. And that was the approach. You take one phenomena and isolate it from the rest of it, and you come up with an explanation of how
cherry picking
boulder ended up there. But when you put it all together, there's really no other explanation. So getting back to James Coulee, they spent a week out in the field. They were walking around looking at all of this stuff. And the last day, they were at a place called Palouse Falls, which is in southeastern Washington, which is a pretty amazing, big bowl-shaped cataract feature. Yeah. And the Palouse River that flows through there now is just a tiny little ribbon, but you've got this massive cataract, right? And this landscape, which for miles around has just been desecrated by these tremendous shear forces of the moving water. So as the story goes, this was the final stop on the last day of their trip, and James Coulee walked away from the group, and he was standing there looking into this big 400-foot deep, basin in the ground with this little waterfall, and stood there looking at that for a long time, and finally walked back to the group and said, "How could I have been so wrong?" And
it's good that he got there, though.
Yeah, it's good that he got there. And see, here's the thing. I mean, Bretz was proposing an extremely radical idea. So yeah, give it your best shot. Do the best you can to do everything to discredit it. But at the end, it stood on its own 2 feet. And that was, at that point, and after that, the geological community began to accept that these floods were real.
They didn't have a choice. It's outstanding evidence.
Exactly. They didn't have a choice. Here's the problem, though. They basically invoked, in the effort to invoke uniformitarian processes, they basically said, okay, well, what we've got here is proglacial lakes, meaning bodies of water in front of the glaciers. They're held in by ice dams. And the reason that was such an attractive idea is because in modern times, we do see examples of that, particularly in Iceland. When you have a volcanic eruption under the ice in Iceland, it melts a reservoir of water, which will eventually, usually within a week to 2 weeks, will force its way through the ice, and it will outburst in this catastrophic flood. You also have them a lot of them in Alaska. They're documented in the Pyrenees, in the Himalayas, in the Andes, in the Rocky Mountains. So they're a real thing. However, and here's the big however to me, when you look at the very largest of the modern outburst floods, they're not even 1,000th the scale of these ancient floods from the end of the last ice age. That's the problem, because we're looking at we might be looking at a total volume of water that's, say, a half a cubic kilometer outbursting. And you might be looking at peak discharges of 20, 30, 40, maybe 50,000 cubic feet per second. When we're talking about these ancient floods, we're talking about hundreds of millions of cubic feet per second, which is almost inconceivable, right? And so I've always maintained, and a few of the geologists looking at this stuff have sort of, admitted that, yeah, can we just extrapolate up and say, well, because we see a modern lake in front of a glacier breaking through an ice dam, can we just scale up 3 orders of magnitude? But that still seems to be the prevalent approach. And the thing about it is that if you study glacial ice, particularly in this kind of environmental context we're looking at here, it is not the kind of a medium that can withstand much hydraulic pressure at all. And when we build modern dams, we use, bedrock grouting to fill every single pore in the bedrock, because if you don't do that, you're going to have a dam failure. And when you look at the Great Dam Failure,
forgive the pun.
And we can see, what's that?
Some damn good statistics.
Some damn good statistics, yeah. Well, as I've always said, the ice dam theory, which is the one that's always invoked now to explain these catastrophic floods, just doesn't hold water.
Literally.
I took a little bit.
Rim shot.
Puns on puns.
So what's the latest science that you have to show us? You were talking about the drumlin stuff. Is there even more stuff that you've been piling on top of the story to help support this theory? And because I want to go through this stuff, and I want to go back at the very end of our podcast and find out what what you're hoping that will come out of this science for humanity, which I know is a bigger picture than what we're talking about, the physical, geological science, that there's a bigger effect that humanity can take from this stuff. But let's go through the science first. What's the latest science that you have to show us? Because I know you got some stuff there on your screen that you'd like to share.
Well, there's constantly new evidence coming forward. And I think one of the most interesting and exciting areas is these discoveries that suggest that Earth was subjected to an impact or series of impacts at the end of the last ice age. That to me is tremendously exciting.
Right.
And that you mentioned earlier in the introduction that, the megafauna extinctions, the dominant theory is the overkill hypothesis, or the idea that human hunters exterminated them. And, I've gone into the literature pretty extensively to try to find out how many people were actually present on the planet at the end of the last ice age. And the estimates I've seen range between 5 and 10 million, which is not a lot of people worldwide, right?
No.
Now, when you look at the estimates for the number of megafauna, I've seen ranges from up to 40 million. I've seen estimates for mammoths of 10 to 12 million. So it's like, even conservatively, there was probably a woolly mammoth for every human, right? So like the idea that humans, certainly humans would have hunted. They were hunter-gatherers. The Clovis people were hunter-gatherers. The Acheuleans were hunter-gatherers in Europe, in Africa. So they probably did hunt mammoths, but when you look at a mammoth, I mean, that's going to be one of the most dangerous, difficult to take down animals out of the whole Pleistocene bestiary.
Easily. It's astounding to think that human beings with no technology were taking down fucking mammoths.
Right, with spears.
With fucking sticks. Even Clovis Point, that's the hook. That's what got him. Like, have you ever tried to spearfish with a stick made of wood?
Oh my God!
It's retarded.
We got to preface that statement because Ben was on Naked and Afraid and had to go through. He had to go through multiple weeks of survival on a desert island in the Bahamas. Is that correct, sir?
Yeah,
something like that. But they, the crew that was filming him had catered lunches and whatnot.
They stopped eating that because we were catching lobster, but I wasn't spearfishing with a fucking stick because that doesn't work, and those are fish. Like,
yeah,
the idea that humans were even cornering mammoths at any mass scale.
Right,
it's preposterous.
Where they couldn't move and just run
it is
in a different.
Preposterous statement. That's like saying the reason that we don't have any evidence about humans and their existence before God was invented on paper is like because they had flying cars. So obviously they didn't drop any of the evidence on the ground. I mean, duh.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree either with the story that man hunted the mammoth to extinction, because I mean,
it's insanity.
The numbers don't add up. You know what I'm saying? I mean, hunter gatherers, from my perspective, the ones that I've met in Peru, as a matter of fact, we took a trip down to Peru and we did some ayahuasca down there just recently, and we saw the indigenous people. We met them, we talked to them.
They're economical.
They are. They do not waste.
It doesn't make sense to waste so much energy and time to hunt a fucking mammoth.
Right. I mean, why would you try to hunt something to its extinction?
I would have hunted 10,000 chipmunks before I tried to chase a fucking mammoth.
Did it say something bad about your mom? I mean, right? And you wanted to kill all of his relatives? I don't understand.
I accidentally stepped on your dog before dogs are domesticated, allegedly.
Yeah. So I mean, we're right there with you that we don't believe that extinction had anything to do with hunting.
If it did at all, it might have been post-catastrophe, because. But see, here's the thing: is the evidence is now showing human population undoubtedly declined at the same time.
Right.
And so
during the cooling.
I look at humans were as much victims of these catastrophes as the megafauna.
But they had to have been, because they are part of megafauna. I mean, they were the megafauna.
Right, we are megafauna.
We are the megafauna.
Yeah,
we're the apex.
We are nature, right? And
we're such a big fauna that we're actually like almost a virus.
Right. Yeah, we are at this point. We're overpopulating.
Legitimately, like too big of fauna.
Yeah, a lot of our natural predators were taken out of the mix 10,000 years ago, and now there's way too many humans. I think
now our natural predator is intelligence.
Yeah, see, people don't understand, and you guys would probably be in a position to understand this better than the average person, but. If you were living during the late Pleistocene, when you got up in the morning, one of your priorities of the day was not to become food for one of the great predators.
You wake up in a stressed state.
That would literally be one of your priorities. I mean, when you look at the apex predators at the end of the last ice age, they're just phenomenal. I mean, Arctodus simus, the giant short-faced bear, he was the top. He was the top. He was at the top of the pyramid. And this guy, nobody could mess with that guy.
It's like a Down syndrome polar bear. Motherfucker, just giant.
Yeah,
a giant. He was a giant. I mean, he stood 6 feet tall at the shoulder. He had long legs. He could run. Dire wolves, the American Pleistocene lion. You had these extraordinary beasts that would be more than happy to eat, make a snack out of a slow running human.
Or 10.
Or 10, yeah.
Honestly, like, I don't know if you've ever been in a fist fight with more than one other human, but it's not usually going to go in your favor.
Right.
So the fact that these things could casually sweep out like 10 or 20 people is just, I mean, it's demonstrative of how insane it is to think that we hunted these things to extinction.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that, Ben, because... Yeah.
Because you're right.
Yeah,
you're right. Yes.
Hunting a single person to extinction is complicated enough. If you can accidentally kill 10 of them off, then they did not hunt you to extinction. That's not how it works.
So what do you have to show us?
Well, gosh, where do we start here?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen we've watched all the stuff that you've said on other podcasts and Joe Rogan in preparation
fans.
for.
We're big fans.
We love this stuff. I mean, I was a big fan long before we started doing the review for doing this show, but we again went back through all that stuff, and I mean, we're on board, and we loved Graham Hancock's books, which borrowed a lot from the science that you had pointed out to tell the whole story of the existing evidence that speaks of flood and the potential impact of large celestial bodies creating the melting heat necessary to create those super floods, etc. What's the latest stuff that you've been working on that you've accumulated?
I would say the latest stuff, I mentioned earlier the drumlins. I've been trying to map the melting process, because I believe that by mapping the melting and finding these epicenters, we can actually pinpoint where there were impacts into the ice sheet. And what I've come to believe now is that there may have been at least 6 or 7 impacts directly into the ice sheet, which caused major melting.
And this is just in the last, like for the last ice age, not for the previous.
Right.
5 or 6?
Right. I think we're looking at a clustered bombardment.
Okay.
I don't know if you guys remember 1994, July of 1994, Shoemaker-Levy 9. You had, let's see, it would have been March of 1993, was discovered a comet that was coming around Jupiter. It passed very close to Jupiter, so it was within what's called the Roche limit, which is basically where Jupiter's gravity field overcomes the internal cohesion of the cometary mass and rips it apart.
Right.
So David Levy was the first discoverer of it, and then Gene Shoemaker and Carolyn Shoemaker, his wife, followed up on it and did the original research. And then Brian Marsden, an astronomer, did the calculations after watching the thing for 3 months, watching the single nucleus break apart into 21 separate pieces. And then Brian Marsden did the calculations and realized that about a year later, these when this train of objects swung around the sun and passed the orbit of Jupiter again, that where it was going to cross the Jovian orbit, Jupiter was going to be right there. So They knew that it was going to be an impact. And since then, one of the kind of, to me, exciting things is that, a lot of comets now have been studied and observed to actually undergo this hierarchy of disintegrations where they basically fragment into separate pieces. One larger one becomes fragmented and becomes multiple smaller pieces. Those smaller pieces can then go through further fragmentation events. And eventually what happens is a comet, if it doesn't get hit a planet or get swept into the sun, which is a very typical life-ending event for a comet, it will actually just eventually disintegrate into cosmic dust.
Right.
But in the case of Shoemaker-Levy 9, we saw 21 impacts into Jupiter within less than a week. And, now there are these catena that are crater chains that are being discovered on all of the solid body planets in the solar system. And we've seen multiple breakups of comets. And so there is now a school of thought that multiple impact events are far more common than anybody had actually imagined. And a lot of the critics of the impact hypothesis, their straw man is that, is this model that, if you're talking about an impact, you're just looking at one singular event that would have one effect, and then that effect is over. But we've actually seen that the melting took, 3,000 or 4,000 years. The megafaunal extinctions didn't happen all at once, which is true. True. So therefore, it wasn't an impact event. But I think what we're looking at is I would call it an impact epoch, where you have a period of time. And I didn't originate this idea. This idea, I think the earliest that I came across this idea was a group of British astronomers, the so-called neo-catastrophist school. Victor Klube was the leader of this group. And they basically, and studied comets and the life cycle of comets for decades, and concluded that multiple impact events were far more common than anybody had realized before. What we've learned in the interim is, verifies that multiple impact events seem to be, again, far more common. And I think that we can explain the events of the end of the last ice age by invoking an idea of multiple impacts. And maybe sometimes, there was a tremendous melting event that was dated at 14,600 years ago. No explanation for what that was. There was then the 12,900 year onset of the Younger Dryas. And that is where the black mat layer is found, where the impact proxies have shown up. The nanodiamonds, the microspherals, the platinum layer, the iridium layer, and so on.
All the solid connections where they actually like hit.
Yeah.
Randall, I got a question before we shift topics, because I was going over some Robert Schoch. Robert Chalk, John Chalk,
Robert Chalk.
Robert Chalk stuff, and something he had mentioned, and I don't know how much of a proponent he is of this, but I didn't realize this either, that a large enough coronal mass ejection would create or induce rather catastrophic lightning strikes all over the Earth.
I think this is plausible too.
But I guess one could, like a comet could do the same thing too, right?
Yes. And really what I think we might be looking at here is a perfect storm of events, because and here's another, in terms of recent research and things that I've been looking into, is sun grazing comets. And there seems to be now a link ever since we've had these solar observing satellites up in the last 20 years. We've discovered and learned a whole lot about the sun we didn't know before. One of the things that has come out of this is the extraordinary numbers of sun grazing comets we have not been able to see, because when you look at the sun, obviously it's so bright it obscures anything like a cometary nucleus. But there have now been hundreds of these sun grazing comets, and like this seems to be one of the most common lifespan terminations for a comet, is to fall into the sun. Well, here's what's interesting to me, and this is just like, I'm very in the early stages of researching this, but I think this could be the thing that sort of brings together what Graham Hancock, for example, has been promoting, which is impact, and what Robert Chalk has been promoting, which is a solar storm, or a CME, or coronal mass ejection. And those two have kind of been going at it for a few years over who's right. I come into the picture and I'm saying, well, I think we're all right. I think because what we're seeing now is that there is a disproportionate response to the sun when these comets fall into the chromosphere. What we're seeing is a comet plunges into the chromosphere, literally moving thousands of kilometers per second, because it's accelerating as it's being sucked in by the sun's enormous gravity field. Plunges into the chromosphere, and then what do we see? We see a solar storm emanating from that spot. We see a huge geomagnetic anomaly. We see solar flares emanating out. And these are small cometary nuclei. If we're looking at a situation like we might have been looking at 12,000, 13,000, 14,000 years ago, which, consistent with the British neo-catastrophists, the idea was that you had a huge comet mass, cometary nucleus comes into the inner solar system, starts like a ping pong game between Jupiter and the sun, begins to fragment, and begins to litter the inner solar system with the debris of its fragmentation. And the Earth, on multiple occasions, might encounter that debris, sometimes to a lesser extent, sometimes to a greater extent. At the same time, a lot of this debris is falling into the sun. The evidence seems to now suggest that the sun might react to that. And so it could very well be that we're looking at, like I said, a perfect storm of stuff. And the sun may have played a very dominant or important role, I'll say an important role, in these events. Because to my knowledge, the 14,600 year melting, I have not found any evidence of any impact proxies at that date. So, but something triggered a massive melting. They call it meltwater pulse 1B. And you had this huge influx of meltwater into the global oceans. And that was the initial rising of sea level. And then, basically 1,300 years later, you had the Younger Dryas. And, that's where the impact proxies are showing up. And then 1,300 years after that, you have what is called the Younger Dryas pre-boreal boundary, which is the 11,600 date, which is the Plato's date. And there may be some initial evidence suggesting an impact at that point, but it's this stuff is so early, in its stages. Nobody has really looked at these boundaries, and if you don't look for something, obviously you're not going to find it.
Yeah, funny thing about that.
Well, the multiple simultaneous impact points. Any kid who's tried to throw a mud ball has probably experienced that, where you put enough energy into a body that doesn't have a lot of cohesion, and it's going to break apart, and you're going to wind up slinging most of your mud in multiple directions.
Like when monkeys throw shit.
Like when monkeys throw shit, exactly. So, which I guess Doug has found out the hard way.
I did have a pet monkey, so I know this.
Shit at each other.
I have done firsthand scientific observations of how they do this.
Yeah. So what? Now,
Yeah,
does the
I mean, I know
drumlin-
that well. One of the things, back in the early '60s, we didn't have, boys didn't have a lot of things. We had to kind of invent our own amusement. So one of the things was that near where I lived, gangs of boys would kind of gather on each side. We would have dirt clod wars.
Yeah,
Oh,
classic.
yeah, mud ball wars.
That or acorn fights.
Mud ball fights.
No, dirt clod wars are much better because they hurt when they hit. But yeah, so I remember well fragmenting dirt clods.
Yeah.
You're always looking for that solid dirt clod to get that.
Or sticking a rock in the center
Yeah,
of it.
rock.
Yeah, or the cheaters here in the
Yeah.
group. We do this. Coat of rock and some like thin layer of dirt,
Or some yellow snow.
or just throw a rock.
So what does the drumlin stuff suggest? Is that just connected with the flooding and how it came down?
Okay, so drumlins, basically, what you have when the glaciers come across the landscape, they basically pulverize the landscape,
Right.
creating this stuff that's called glacial till,
Right.
which in the old days was called drift
Right.
because it was associated with flowing water. Well, so you have glacial till, which is this ground up landscape. It's gravel and rocks and sand and silt, and it's just might be organic material. It's all mingled together chaotically. There's no structure to it, which differentiates it from water-laid material, which will usually have a discernible structure.
Right.
Bedding,
Flow with different
layering.
density.
Yeah, exactly. You and that's how you differentiate between the two. But so basically what happens is when you have water moving under the glacier, and this was back to John Shaw again, his idea is that these drumlin fields were produced by subglacial, huge subglacial, beneath the glaciers, floods that were under pressure. They didn't have a free surface. So the hydraulic consequences were very different from a water mass flowing over the landscape that has a free surface, so that the water is free to change its depth and so forth according to the topography. But when you have the subglacial floods, it's capped by an ice sheet. And
Would
so
that leave a different signature?
it would leave a very different signature. What it does now is it takes that glacial till and shapes it into these aerodynamic forms. And I could actually, hopefully it won't glitch the thing. I can pull up
No, go ahead.
Google Earth here, and then I'm going to do a screen share.
Sure.
Nerd.
So basically, what the difference would be I've seen like serration of mountains that was caused by glacial movement, and this would be a much more even fluid erosion caused by that, thanks to the fact that the water's moving, right, and the water gives a little bit.
Yes.
Okay.
And so what it's doing is because it's moving under pressure now, it's shaping that glacial till in ways that the water that's not moving under other than its own pressure is able to do. And I'm going to pull up, I'll show you an example of an amazing drumlin field. You guys ever been in Western New York?
I have not.
Okay, so I'm going
Is
to
Rochester, Western New York?
Yes, Rochester is right there at the top end of a really impressive drumlin field. And let's see here. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to pull out here. I've got Google Maps. Now I'm going to go to open this up and go to screen share. And hopefully this will work. Let me know when you see the maps.
Yahtzee.
Good. Okay, so we're looking at Lake Ontario, and I don't have the bathymetric map of Lake Ontario, but over here in the eastern end of Lake Ontario is a deep circular basin. And then you look immediately south, and you see the Finger Lakes. And what's interesting about the Finger Lakes is they're basically radial. Let me put this down, see if you can actually see. Maybe I have to stop share again to see me. Yeah, okay. Your screen sharing is paused. Let's say resume share. Okay, so picture, if you hold your hand up in front of your face and spread your fingers, right? And they're kind of, you would say that there's a radial distribution. If you look at the Finger Lakes and you follow the axes of these Finger Lakes, what you'll see is they all converge on this deep basin that's on eastern Ontario.
Right.
Now, the north end of the Finger Lakes, and I'm going to draw my cursor right across here. You see the town of Geneva, Seneca Falls, Auburn. Okay, that represents the southern margin of the ice sheet right there. So the Finger Lakes were just outside the glacier. When you're north of there, you're under the ice, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in, and you'll be able to see the drumlin fields. Let's go on in here. Hopefully we will get enough. Here we go. Check. See, these are all, can you see these?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. They're like inverted boat hulls. They almost look like if you turned a canoe upside down.
Right.
And why is a boat hull shaped as it is? Because it's trying to minimize the frictional drag as the boat moves through the water. Well, what's happening here is the water is doing the same thing as it's moving through these fields of glacial till. It's shaping, when it comes to irregularities within the glacial till, what it does is tries to shape them into the form that will provide the least frictional resistance to the movement of the water. And so this is an example of an extraordinary drumlin field. And you can really, as I'm scanning over here, you can see there's thousands of them.
Wow.
Seems pretty evident.
Oh yeah, and
So is there debate on this? What caused them?
Yes, this is the debate. What caused the drumlins? And if you go through the drumlin literature, you're going to find that there's probably 50 different theories, all attempting to explain the existence of drumlins as a result of somehow direct glacial action. And it was John Shaw who came along in the 80s and proposed this idea of subglacial floods and said, look, for a lot of technical reasons we could get into, but it would probably take us far afield. That is the most likely explanation. For one thing, many of the drumlins have internal stratification, which again is not consistent with simply creation by direct glacial action, because like I said, the glaciers don't sort. Water will sort. Water will create bedding. Water will create these shapes. And thing about drumlins is blunt on the upstream end, tapered on the downstream end.
Yeah, it's directional.
And this is consistent. Yes, and so basically the critics of Shaw, and I'm showing you one drumlin field here, but there are massive drumlin fields. I'm going to scan over here, I'm going to zoom out, and this is one I passed through earlier this year. If I go to southern Wisconsin here, let's see here if we can find that. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. We're now in Wisconsin. There we go. Can you see the drumlins?
Yeah.
These elongated, tapered hills. And if you look at them, they're in a radiating pattern.
Right.
Yep.
And they're emanating from, see, Oshkosh, Lake Winnebago here is a scour trough that was hollowed out by the shear forces of moving water. And you had water coming off the ice sheet diverging that came down, cut this pathway that is now Green Bay. And you see this, we're looking at a trough here that was created catastrophically.
Right.
The water came down here. As it came down towards the edge of the glacier, then you had the drumlin field. And then as soon as the water comes free of the glacier, then the drumlin fields stop, because now the water is not pressure under that tremendous pressure that shapes the glacial till. Now, the critics of John Shaw said that the drumlin fields are so vast that you can't provide an explanation for how you would get that much water beneath the glaciers. That's the essence of the criticism.
Isn't that a straw man argument though? That's like saying,
Yeah, it's a
hey,
logical
there's
fallacy.
it's like saying, hey, there's a giant ball of gas in the sky called the sun. It's like, well, if you can't prove how it was formed, fuck you.
Yeah.
It's like, no, I'm not here to show you creation of existence. I'm showing you the evidence of what's going on right now.
Total logical
It
fallacy.
sounds like a actual cognitive fallacy. It sounds like a straw man argument.
Well, yeah, and that's how I look at it. And I mean, but they have a point, is that, and I've just shown you two small sections. I mean, we could go up into Ontario, Quebec. We could go over to British Columbia. Like I said, I spent 4 days with Jerome Lessman, Professor Jerome Lessman, who is one of the I would consider him one of the world's foremost experts on drumlins. He's with Vancouver Island University. I spent 4 days in the field with him a couple of years ago studying the drumlin fields of British Columbia. And the reason we went up there was because I believe that there was a connection between that drumlin swarm up on the Nechako Plateau of central British Columbia and the source of the water that created the channel Scablands. And interestingly, he agreed with me. I mean, and he had already independently kind of come to that conclusion. And so you have the Canadian geologists who are looking and saying, I think we believe that the source of these floods is actually up here in Canada. And then you have the American geologists who are clinging to the idea that no, the channel Scablands was created by this giant proglacial lake in western Montana that was over 600 cubic miles of water. Now, think about this. If you went outside and you were trying to visualize an ice cube that's 1 cubic mile, a mile high and a mile wide and a mile deep, well, and then if you were to suddenly melt that would be a pretty traumatic flood right there, right? Well, so here's Glacial Lake Missoula. I say Lake Missoula with over 600 cubic miles, but nobody is saying, well, where did all of that fucking water come from?
Right.
You see, all they're doing is kicking the can upstream, so to speak. That water had to come from somewhere, and I'm telling you, it came out of Canada. It came from catastrophically melting ice up over the Canadian Rockies.
Now, do you believe the radial phenomena points to the impact points of the celestial bodies coming down?
Well, this is what I was trying to show you there with the Western New York drumlin field.
There's an impact point there. There's an impact point over in Wisconsin.
Well, in Wisconsin, I think that the impact point there was actually up in Canada.
Okay.
And a lot of that water scoured out what is now the basin of Lake Superior. Another channel of that meltwater scoured out what is now the basin of Lake Michigan.
Okay.
And you had catastrophic floods emanating from both of those ice lobes.
Okay.
So, sorry, I'm really hung up on the counter argument here. You know, I've seen gunshot wounds. Not once did I have to prove that it came from a gun. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh no, that's not a gunshot wound unless you show me the gun, the person who shot it. It's like, no, we're gonna deal with the issue. We're gonna look at the evidence here, and we're gonna move forward. I don't understand.
Cut yourself with your knife again.
I don't understand the argument. It's not intelligent.
I agree. And once you've looked at this stuff for a long time, you know, and you know, you go through all the alternative ideas, and one by one, when you really critically examine them, they basically fall apart. And what you're left with is we've got to look at something extraordinary here. That's the only way we can explain this. And the evidence now is you know, again, part of the problem is nobody really looked for it up until, you know, the last decade or two. And once they started looking for it, then they begin to discover, yeah, my gosh, look, here's this black mat layer. And below that, we find abundant megafauna. And above it, we find almost no megafauna. Below it, we find the Clovis people. Above it, no Clovis people. They've disappeared, right? And nobody had really taken a good look at that because maybe we just didn't have the resolution to discern what's going on. But once they begin to take a look at it, that's when they begin to discover the fingerprints of a cosmic event, which goes totally against the grain of the gradualist dogmas that now still are entrenched in academia, academic models of Earth history.
Yeah.
And to me, like, you know, trying to solve these questions, it's analogous to finding an old puzzle set in, you know, your grandfather's attic. Is, you know, you start going through the pieces, you start putting a picture together. The picture starts to come a little more clear, like you said, a higher resolution. If you find a piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit, you don't throw it away. You say, oh shit, there's a whole nother puzzle I need to solve here. And it seems like a lot of the counter arguments, or people are kind of ensconced in their own dogma, just disregard the fact that it's a different piece to a different puzzle.
Yeah, they're like, no, it's not a puzzle, that's chicken. Doesn't taste like chicken.
So you guys want to look at some slides here of of some of the great flood features.
Yes.
I usually start with the stuff out in the Pacific Northwest because that's where it's most spectacularly displayed. And once you begin to come to understand and be able to visualize this stuff, then you can see it where it might be preserved more subtly. Because a lot of this is just spectacular in your face. Other cases, it's more subtle. And you have to kind of learn to read this. It's a cipher, literally. It's a language that you learn to read. And
Randall, I had a question. So I was recently in the Portland, Oregon area, and I had some free time, so I explored the Columbia River. And I was there with some family, and I was discussing Multnomah Falls.
Multnomah
Falls. And there's a big undercut. And correct me if I explained this correctly. And I think I only explained it correctly due to you, if I explained it correctly. But I was asking my niece, who's 13 at the time, I was asking her, the falls is just beautiful and it's dramatic. But you look and there's a huge undercut behind it. I asked her, I was like, hey, how did that happen? And she's like, oh, I don't know, the waterfall cut it. And I go, so you're telling me the waterfall that's flowing underneath cut the huge, is it a cataract? Is that a cataract?
Not exactly. I'll show you a picture of a cataract in a second.
But I was explaining to her that there was a large enough flood that cut into the side of the hill where there was once a stream flowing, and now it appears like there's an undercut with a small stream flowing over into the Columbia River.
We have to bear in mind that whole Columbia Gorge was cut by these giant floods sweeping through there, in some cases between 400 and 800 feet deep. And so if you have let's say a gradual river valley, typical sort of a more gentle profile, and then you suddenly have 3 or 4 or 500 million cubic feet per second rushing through there, here's what it does. It begins to rapidly downcut, and it'll shear off the sides. And what you're looking at there is the remnants of this passage of these massive flood currents that essentially sheared off the valley sides and left these 400-foot cliffs. So the streams that were once flowing into what would have been a more typical river valley with essentially more gentle sloped sides now are coming up, and there's this huge chasm there, and they're just plunging down 400 feet. When you see that undercutting, that's because this water is extremely turbulent. So there's eddies like this. And then as the water declines down, what will happen is there may be a more sustained flow after the initial peak discharge. And that sustained flow will continue to eat away at the sides. Now, in the case of the Columbia there at Multnomah Falls, you're looking at, that's pretty much all basalt in there. Mm-hmm. So what it'll do is it'll shear off the basalt, and then as the floodwaters go down, it continues to eat into the bedrock laterally. And so it'll create these overhanging precipices, these overhanging rock formations, and the undercutting, which is something you can see many examples of that are clear indication of outsized water flows, flows beyond what the modern scale of flows.
So even though I didn't explain it as eloquently as you did, I did explain it to her correctly solely because of you, just to be clear. So thank you for that.
Well done.
I'm touched, Doug. I now feel vindicated.
Good.
Your life has meaning.
My life has meaning.
I'll let my niece know.
Okay, we're going to go quickly through a series of slides here. I guess I need to hit screen share first so you can see what I'm seeing. Share. Here we go. We will look at some digital maps first. Okay, so this is what's known as the Telford Scabland tract. And you can see very clearly here that where all of the this darker area, this is where the Loess topsoil, which in some cases is 200 feet thick, has been stripped away to the basalt bedrock, exposed the bedrock, and around where the soil, this Loess topsoil, as it's called, actually happens to be very fertile stuff. And so with a little bit of watering, which, since the building of Grand Coulee Dam, part of that was a vast irrigation system to irrigate the Columbia Basalt Plateau. And because the only thing that Loess lacked for being a very viable agricultural area was moisture, because there's only 15 inches or so of rainfall here on the eastern side of the Cascades. So what happened now is you see all of the little squares, you can see all of this is agricultural in here. But then interspersed in there is the stripped away bare rock. And this is the scars, literal scars, left behind as these tremendous floods swept over the land. And you can see it's how deeply some of these channels here are 300-400 feet deep. The estimate is that they were probably gouged out literally in a matter of a week or two. But we'll go through some here. Let's just see. I'm going to.
Crop circles.
Who said that? Was that you, Sean?
No, it wasn't me.
It was Doug.
No.
No, Doug. These are not crop circles.
Yeah, Doug.
Taking the blame for that one.
No aliens.
That was Ben.
Okay. I'll eventually learn to recognize your voices. I think I've got you down now that I know who's saying stuff. But we're looking here.
I'm the smart one.
Okay, that's what I tell people. You know, I'm partners with my younger brother in the building business, and whenever we're meeting new people, I say, "How you can tell us apart is I'm the smart, good-looking one. He's the other
Exactly. That's like,
But, you
that's
know-
like when I tell my dad that good luck skips a generation.
one." Yeah, good. Yeah,
Randall gets it. So, yeah.
I get it. Yes.
Yeah, he gets us.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you know, I'm sure it's like with you. Listen, you don't survive the kind of in the construction business. You do not survive without a sense of humor. You would quickly,
No, it's pivotal.
quickly go under.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've done roof work where it's 10 degrees out, and I've done roof work when it's 105 degrees, and everything in between. And you know, it's like, okay, well, this is where you have to gird up your loins and tough it out.
And make fun of yourself along the way. Otherwise,
And
someone
make
else
fun
will.
of yourself
The
yes.
whole time.
Right. As you're feeling sorry for yourself.
Well, duh, but you can't tell anybody that.
No. Okay, so here we're looking at Grand Coulee. If you've ever heard of Grand Coulee Dam, it's the largest concrete massive structure in North America. We've got Upper Grand Coulee and Lower Grand Coulee here, and Grand Coulee is an extraordinary feature. There was a massive meltwater flow that came from the north, came down. If you follow my cursor, it's cutting down here, the Upper Coulee and then Lower Coulee. And then down here in this basin, the water spread out and created a fan built out of all of the material that was stripped out of the creation of Grand Coulee. And one of the areas that's really interesting in Grand Coulee is the transition between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee, where you now have this Dry Falls Cataract, which I'll show you a few slides subsequent here to this one. And then over here to the left, we have another magnificent coulee called Moses Coulee. And can you see this kind of arcuate or semicircular feature here? You see this?
Yeah.
Okay. That represents the southern terminus of a glacial lobe called the Okanagan lobe. And basically what's happening there is the lobe of ice moves. It's in very oversimplified terms, it's essentially bulldozing up masses of this debris, this glacial till that forms what's called terminal moraine, which piles up at the snout of the glacial lobe. Then when the glacier lobe recedes back, it leaves this calling card in the form of this arcuate moraine here. And so what you can see right here is this represents the southern terminus of this lobe. And you can see that Moses Coulee is emanating right off of that lobe. It was a direct meltwater event coming off of this lobe of the ice sheet. And this particular coulee varies between 800 and 1,000 feet deep. It's 1 mile to 2 miles wide. It was literally cut, I think, simultaneous. I think these two coulees were cut at the same time by these huge meltwater flows. And to give you an idea, the meltwater flow that created either one of these things was roughly 20 times the volume of every single creek, stream, and river on Earth flowing all together.
Wow.
All rivers flowing together.
Wow.
Literally
Each
cannot
one of
fathom
these-
that.
No, each one of these literally like 10 times the volume of every every bit of flowing water on Earth. And so together, you're looking at a flow that would have been 20 times greater than every river on Earth flowing together.
So like my wife's period.
I'm not going to comment on that.
Grimshaw?
Interestingly, when you get into the mythology and the symbology, there's some interesting, the breaking of the waters. Symbology has a lot of interesting things. We can do a future conversation, and we should do a follow-up to this, maybe later over the holidays or early next year or something, if you guys are into it.
Yeah, totally.
Good. Okay, so we're going to go through some more slides here, so you can now start seeing what some of this stuff looks like from a little closer up. So here's a digital map of Upper and Lower Grand Coulee. Now, there's a lake presently in Upper Grand Coulee, and right up here at the very top of the screen is Grand Coulee Dam, which was built back in the 1930s and created what is called Franklin Roosevelt Lake here. And so what they did was, once they created that reservoir of water, they pumped it up out of the Columbia Basin here, up into Grand Coulee. They built a dam at the southern end of Upper Grand Coulee, and they use this, and there are aqueducts that emanate outwards from Upper Grand Coulee, taking the irrigation water out to irrigate the extensive Loess fields that surround this, like I was explaining to you. But right here at this transition between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee is a complex called Dry Falls Cataract Complex, and we're going to take a closer look at that. What you can see here, what I have identified, is called Coulee Monocline. Can you see me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so a monocline is if you have compression on the crust and it'll buckle, right? Right, because it can buckle up and become an anticline. It can buckle down and become a syncline, or it can buckle so you go from one level up to another level, and that's a monocline. So an anticline, there's up and then there's back down. A syncline is down and back up, and a monocline is just up or down. And you can see this monocline right here. What happened is this water comes gushing off the ice sheet. It flowed down here and then poured over the monocline. And what you had there was a waterfall that was about 2 miles wide and 900 feet high. And it began to eat its way back up into the bedrock and ate its way all the way back up here to the edge of the ice sheet, creating Upper Grand Coulee. Once the water hit the monocline, it began to see, when you create that monocline, what's happening is that uplift is fracturing the bedrock and creating zones of weakness, right? So the water flowing through there is going to exploit those zones of weakness and begin to strip them out. And that's what happened with Lower Grand Coulee down here. And I'm hoping that in the future, we're going to do a field trip and we will go up, we'll make a traverse up this coulee. And it's one of the most impressive features, I think, on Earth, especially when you know what its genesis is and you realize that what a truly phenomenal feature you're looking at here. We're going to zoom in on this area that marks the transition between Upper and Lower Grand Coulee. We'll just hurry through some of this. You can basically see it just down here. You can begin to see the cataract complex in the lower area. And you begin to see, let's see, Grand Coulee Dam is right up here. And interestingly, Grand Coulee Dam pretty much marks the position where that ice sheet ended right there. But we will go. There's one feature I want to point out to you right here. It's called Steamboat Rock, which is a mesa that was left. And what you got to understand is that prior to this flood, this was a continuous layer of basalt across here. Right here, it's 5 miles wide and about 900 feet deep. If the flood had continued on beyond even maybe a few more days from before the tap got turned off, this feature right here would have been washed away. It wouldn't exist anymore. Let's keep going here. Here's an aerial photograph. This is Steamboat Rock in the distance, and we're looking south down Grand Coulee. So now, prior to the flood, bear in mind that this was 1,000 feet of basalt that was continuous across here.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Stripped away, leaving this island that would have been in the midst of this unbelievably raging flood. Let's keep going.
Wow.
So here's here's a topographic map showing Steamboat Rock and a lot of the features around here. Like, see this? This is a cataract right here, and that doesn't have a name. But you'll see how those cataracts form. Check this out. Okay, so you've got Castle Rock right here, and next to it you've got this cataract. So this is an aerial photograph I took, I think, back in 1998. Here you see the cataract, and here you see Castle Rock.
Looks like an eddy.
Yeah, and so picture the water is pouring over this, and as it's pouring over, what it's doing is it's plucking the bedrock and essentially eroding it or eating its way upstream.
Sure.
The longer the water
vertical
flows,
eddy.
the more that cataract is going to recess upstream.
Right.
Here's an old aerial view of Steamboat Rock.
Wow.
Here's one that I took from the ground. And let's see, here is some of the kinds of sedimentary evidence you find within the coulee itself. So as the floodwaters are declining, bear in mind that these floodwaters are choked with sediment and debris. So they're sweeping along. And when the water finally begins to slow down, what it does is it begins to deposit all this material that it's carrying. And if you look carefully here, you can actually see this is almost like a preservation, a cross section where you can actually almost see the currents preserved in the gravel deposits. And then within that, you'll see these isolated, this is a granitic boulder here, and this is a basalt, this dark one down here is a basalt boulder. Because right here is where two different types of bedrock come together.
Right.
On the east side, you have basalt. On the west side, you've got granite.
So, quick question: is there a debate on the mechanism in which created that landscape?
No. Everybody now agrees that this is created by a catastrophic flood. The controversy becomes is what was the origin and cause of this catastrophic flood. That's where the controversy now lies. You're not going to have, I don't think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who disagreed with the fact that this was catastrophically produced.
Yeah, Michael Shermer might, but
listen, I think he knows better now.
yeah.
And for the sake of Shermer, it's a good thing that debate didn't go another 30 minutes, because really the debate came to an end just at the point where I was ready to unleash the dogs of war on poor Michael Shermer. But I started feeling sorry for him towards the end, and
I did too.
I did
watched
too,
that.
yeah.
I felt a little bad.
Painful.
Yeah, it got a little painful.
Poor guy.
it got a little painful. But we all were congenial at the end, and hey, he does what he does, and there's an important role for the skeptic. And in the case of Michael Shermer, again, when you propose these kind of preposterous ideas, they deserve to be criticized. Well, what happens though is the criticism sometimes will be its own undoing, because once you go back and forth and have this exchange of ideas, a lot of times the criticisms don't hold up anymore. And that's basically like what's happening with the impact hypothesis. The guys who attacked it are basically having to retreat now, because the evidence is overwhelming at this point that, Earth did get impacted by something that happened. So here's an aerial photograph taken in the 1960s. This was, forget the guy's name. It'll come to me in a second. He was a geologist and a pilot, and he did a really wonderful book called Geology Illustrated. And a lot of his photography was helping to turn the tide back in the early 60s towards acceptance of a catastrophic model for the Scablands. But this is part of the cataract complex. And you can see these big horseshoe shapes here. That's very typical, because when water flows, it's actually flowing faster in the center of the flow, and near the margins of the flow, the perimeter, it's flowing slower.
Right.
Because it's flowing faster in the middle, it's more erosive. And so basically what happens if you do a velocity profile, it would look like a U, with the top of the U being the fastest flow, but the erosion features that it creates are the inverse of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking at here. So you can see here a couple of things. You see the eroded bedrock. And by the way, these cliffs are about 400 feet high. And you notice the texture of the bedrock here.
It looks like a beach that you would walk up to that was coming up with high tide.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to keep going here. So you can see here's Horseshoe Falls at Niagara. Very typical cataract formation, the famous Horseshoe Falls, formed because of this differential velocity profile in the water flow. And you can see Niagara Falls is pretty impressive. I don't know if either of you guys have been there. I took a group up there back in, 2001, just so we could see and get a sense of the scale of Niagara Falls, which is pretty damn impressive. And, when you're there, the thunderous roar of the falls and the power, it's mind-boggling. But then when we get to Dry Falls, what I've done is I've inserted a little picture up here in the left, which is scaled. So this is Niagara Falls scaled to Dry Falls Cataract.
Wow.
So you'll notice that it's actually pretty minuscule compared to the ancient.
Crazy.
This is an extinct cataract. And this is only one cataract. Like it says here, distance across this single alcove as shown is 2,000 feet. The whole cataract complex is 5 miles wide. So the water, we're looking north here, the water flowed from the north and swept over. The water was estimated to be right here about 400 feet deep. So the depth of the water was about the same as the height of the cliff here. And during the peak of the flood, you wouldn't have actually even seen a waterfall. You just seen a bump.
Right. And you can see the striations there in the background too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And the fall is exactly the same shape.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a picture from the ground, and I'll insert Niagara Falls for scale.
Jeez. Get out of there, Niagara. Go home, you're drunk.
Pretty impressive, isn't it?
It's immensely impressive.
Yes. And so here is just below falls, looking south down Grand Coulee. And I want to call your attention over here to the cliff faces. And you see these piles of bouldery gravel swept up on the sides. Yeah. This is not ordinary talus that falls off the cliffs and piles up. This is material that was being swept along in the waters of the flood. And when the currents finally declined and settled down, it mantled the sides of the canyon it had cut and the floor with this massive amounts of debris.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't look chunky like it would have come off the rock face, right?
No, exactly.
It looks ground up.
It looks ground up. Yeah, and here you can see it pretty clearly in this. And the basalt, goes back to episodes of outflow dating from about 6 million to about 17 million years ago. And you had multiple flows, and you would have a flow, it would solidify, you'd have another flow on top of it. So now you have this bedding plane separating the two flows. When the floods came through, a lot of times what they did was they stripped off and left the surface. And what you see here is, as it's called here, the Grand Ronde basalt. This was an earlier layer, and then there were layers on top of it that got stripped away, leaving this shelf. And then you also see what I call it the wash-up debris, the stuff that's been washed up, because we're actually sort of in a curve right here, and you have to picture the water kind of rushing around this curve. And as it does, this material is just being washed up against the sides of the cliff.
Right.
And this is at the southern end looking up. And of course, these cliffs here are about 900 feet high.
Sure.
And each of these is called a hanging valley. And what happens is whenever it rains, these become temporary waterfalls spilling over. But just like with Multnomah Falls, it's the same deal. The water comes through and has stripped through and created these cliffs. Because prior to that, this was a continuous layer of basalt linking the west side to the east side.
Wow.
And then when you get at the bottom end of Grand Coulee, you've got this big debris fan. It's called the Ephrata fan. And it's spread out. And the approximate boundaries of this fan are in red here. You can see here, there's this basin. This is the bottom end of Grand Coulee. And you can see this texture here where all of this material spread out. And then the residual flows kind of did its final work, like the frosting on top of the cake. They did their final etching and shaping of the landscape and left this, for example, this is Moses Lake, which looked like a typical meandering river, but it's not a river, it's a lake. But that meander was like one of the last products of the declining floodwaters. And now it's a trough scoured out that's occupied by a lake.
Is that horizontal line at the bottom of that last slide where the debris kind of collected or started to collect?
This right here?
Yeah.
No, that is actually an anticline. What I was talking about earlier.
Right,
where the basalt got compressed. But when you sit, actually, and I don't know if I've got this slide here, but yeah, you picture a tsunami loaded with debris, and it washed up and basically washed against this pre-existing anticline.
Yeah.
And so all along the base of this anticline, you've got huge masses of material that got dumped there.
Yeah, because I'd be interested that, that would be a lot of evidence that would be collected there because of the resistance. And
it's kind of like washed up on shore.
Yeah,
that exactly.
You could analyze.
Now, the elevation difference, this is called Babcock Ridge over here. And the elevation difference between the ridge and this area here, which is called Drumheller Channels, is 400 feet.
Okay.
Now, Drumheller Channels was the main outlet for the water. This is 9 miles wide. Now, you got a picture right there. You got a river 9 miles wide, 400 feet deep.
Jeez.
But even that flow was so great that this 9 mile wide depression here couldn't handle all the water, and it backed up and filled this whole basin here called Quincy Basin, and it spilled over Babcock Ridge in 3 places. And these are huge extinct cataract complexes on the scale of Dry Falls that we just looked at, where the water spilled over and had created these tremendous temporary waterfalls of water flowing down into the Columbia Gorge there. Over here we see the southern terminus of Moses Coulee, where it comes down and meets the Columbia right here. And this is an amazing location right here because you've got 2 gigantic flood currents coming together. And that's what created this pointed topography right here.
Right.
But when you get down into this debris fan here, which covers this whole area, it's more than 1,000 square miles, several hundred feet deep of this stuff.
Wow.
This is the whole Ephrata debris fan. And when you look at this, most of it's basalt, this dark stuff, but scattered in there is pink granite, whose source is up in the Canadian Rockies, which is one of the reasons that I say, no, we have to look at something beyond just a proglacial lake in Missoula.
Yeah.
There's tons of this evidence that contradicts the prevailing model.
Yeah.
This pink granite right here is one of them. But yeah, when you let's see, let's find, yeah. So this is looking at the debris fan. And let's see, you can barely see, I think there's a person out right here on this rock, sitting on that rock. Let's go here. This is an aerial view. This is from about 2,500 feet up. These large boulders here are basically the size of houses.
Heck of a fodder for your dirt clod war.
Yeah. So yeah, that's Grand Coulee. Okay, check this out. Now, this is upper and lower Moses Coulee, and you can see here. Look at the texture of the bedrock here, and what's interesting is you see stuff like this. Let's see. Let me go back up. I think I've got it here. Do I have it? I got pictures of Martian landscapes that look almost exactly the same because there were gigantic floods on Mars as well.
Sure.
But let's go through here. So yeah, here's that V. So here you had maybe 350 million cubic feet per second coming down here, meeting at least that much water coming down this way. And so those arrows there show the water flow. And all of this is debris. When that water from Moses Coulee hit the Columbia, basically all that material spread out in both directions and created this massive debris fan that's similar to what we were just seeing. Here it is from the air. And so the Columbia is coming this way. We're looking up Moses Coulee here. These are 900-foot cliffs. There's probably 200 to 300 feet of gravel filling the bottom of the Coulee. So it's really going to be closer to 1,200 feet deep if you were to clean out the gravel. And here you can see the Columbia River, the present Columbia River. We're looking up Moses Coulee. And here you can see this huge debris fan splayed out from the mouth of Moses Coulee. that now, you can look at the scale of the thing. Here's a railroad down here. There's a highway. This debris fan here is at least 300 to 400 feet thick.
Yeah.
So this is the stuff that was swept out. And the flow that came off the ice sheet was so great that the existing pre-flood topography was just overwhelmed. And the new flows didn't follow the old terrain. It just cut right across the new terrain.
Wow.
Yeah. So these are cliffs that have just been sheared off.
And the amount of energy that's required to do that. I mean, we're talking about water, which doesn't compress, but it's pretty malleable. I mean, it takes the shape of the container that it's within, and it'll move and it'll find the path of least resistance. But when you talk about the amount of power that's required to shear off multiple mountain faces and just push its way through an area, you're talking about immense amounts of energy.
Oh, tremendous amounts. And that's the thing that I keep trying to say. Until you've spent some time out in the field, it's very difficult to wrap your head around it because it's on such a scale. But now what I've been doing, and I've got future trips planned, is I've been basically documenting the entire southern margin of the ice complex from east to west. And all the way along there, you find evidence of these gigantic floods. The Mississippi was overwhelmed by massive floods. In fact, every river valley that headed upon the ice sheets carried these tremendously augmented current flows. And mostly the modern river valleys, geologists have a term, they call them underfit rivers, which is that the modern rivers are minuscule compared to the valleys that they're flowing in. And this is an example of the modern rivers following the ancient channels that were cut by these catastrophic floods.
Wow. And
let's see, I should have a good picture here of.
I think you need more slides.
What?
You don't have enough slides.
Yeah, I need more slides.
Yeah.
Okay, now here is an example of an erratic. Now, basalt, if it was being rolled and tumbled in the water, it would quickly break up, right? And create these piles of debris. If it was carried in the ice itself, it would tend to be broken up eventually. What we have here is erratics that were rafted aboard icebergs. And those icebergs are being swept along in the flood currents. And if you look at this picture, you'll notice that there are erratic boulders strewn across the hillsides here, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I photoshopped out the people that were in this picture, and I'm going to put them back in so you can get a sense of the scale we're talking about here.
Oh my God.
Wow.
This is
Jeez.
Yeah. Here's another one. This is 400 feet above the modern river. So this tells you that right here, the water was at least this high.
Right.
It was carrying an iceberg, and on this iceberg is this huge erratic boulder.
Right.
When water settles down, the icebergs come to ground, and then they melt away. And as they melt away, they leave their cargo of gigantic boulders strewn across the landscape.
Right.
Is that Graham Hancock on top of that rock?
No, that's actually my buddy, Brad Young, who I've been working with for about 23 or 24 years now. But I do have, let's see. Well, actually, this is not Graham, but I have this same, I took Graham to this basalt erratic right here, which I call the Wenatchee erratic. And it's also 400 feet above the modern Columbia. So it's on a ridge, on a hillside. And so what happened was this boulder was being transported aboard this iceberg. The iceberg came to ground on this ridge. The iceberg melted away and left this massive rock. So, you got a picture now. What size of an iceberg would it take to float a rock like this?
Yeah.
And then you got to imagine, okay, what kind of a current flow necessary to float that iceberg and transport it?
Right. Yeah, the energy level is just unfathomable.
Unfathomable. And when you travel across the landscape, you begin to see these things. Like this is called the Jaeger rock, and it just sits by the side of the road, and you can get a sense of how big it is. And there are thousands of these things strewn over the landscape.
They just look so out of place.
Yeah.
They are out of place. That's why they're called erratics. But you see, this is south of the ice sheet. So this was not deposited directly by the glacier. This was a secondary consequence of the floods.
So chunks of the glacier broke off, flooded in the river that had the rocks. Okay.
Yes, exactly. And you notice this mound of debris. The thing is that these glaciers are not clean ice; they're dirty ice. So if you break up the glacier,
the only ice I like.
A lot of meltwater. The glacier is swept along. The glacier comes to ground. When it melts, it leaves a pile of debris that was all material that was entrained within the ice itself.
Yeah.
This is called a berg mound. And that's one of the ways we can identify iceberg rafted erratics, because see, this one is sitting in a berg mound. So this was on top of the iceberg, and this stuff was within the iceberg.
Damn.
That's amazing.
Here's an old a graphic from a 19th-century geology textbook that I found. It really does depict what the process would have looked like.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
And really
Who drew that?
That was Edvard Riau, who was mainly known for being the illustrator of all Jules Verne's books.
Yeah.
But he did the illustrations for this particular book called The World Before the Deluge. Very interesting book.
Wow.
Notice 1866. This was before gradualism took over.
Right.
And yet you can see here, this is far more accurate and realistic depiction of what happened right here in 1866.
You know what? I think we need to just erase the entire 20th century from our history and just call it a mistake.
It's like the terrible twos of our consciousness.
I like that.
So we're definitely going to do another episode with you, Randall. This is amazing stuff. I want to shift the gear for a second, though, because I want to ask you from because I know you and I share this. Because I heard you make this comment before. You and I share this opinion that we would love another 700 or 800 years of our lifetime to be able to forward our science and complete what we started before we die off. But from a pragmatic perspective of, only having one lifetime to get this message conveyed and get this science uncovered, what is your hope for humanity in being able to understand the reality of our history? And what do you hope to have come from this science being uncovered?
Good question. Well, I think as we're all going to agree here, mainstream media, huge percentage of modern focus and attention is on stuff that's just utterly superficial. Mm-hmm. It has no bearing on our long-term well-being or our survival as a species. What is happening now is it's just one distraction after another that's being put out there to keep people diverted from the stuff that really does matter. And
right. I
think what's happening here is that there's this small group of us, like me and Graham, Robert Schock, John Anthony West, he was a little elder. But I was certainly influenced by him way back in the 70s. He's no longer with us now, but he was definitely a ringleader in this paradigm shift. But a lot of us are about the same age. We started into this and listen, I've got to give credit to psychedelics too, because back between 68 and 70, when I was doing psychedelics, I started into it totally naive, not knowing at all what I was expecting. And what happened was my whole world was exploded. But what it
we can relate.
Yeah. What it led into was before. And initially, I had very good sources. I won't get into specifics, although it probably doesn't matter now a half century later, but I had a direct pipeline to, the good stuff right out of Sandoz laboratory back then. But what happened is I discovered that where I really liked having these experiences was out in nature.
Right.
And, initially I would do it and, go to rock concerts and rock festivals and things like that. And having a lot of fun and seeing the light shows and the rock music, which totally blew me away and stuff. But come spring of 1969, I started getting out on the road and basically, again, like I said, I liked hiking and camping and stuff. And what I discovered was doing peyote, doing acid, things like that, was it seemed like it was almost like I got the sense that I was seeing through time, and I was beginning to perceive these hidden images in the landscape.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely can attribute that this correlation there, that some of my earliest awakenings were I'm tripping and I'm seeing some of these phenomena and going, there's something else here. There's something superimposed upon what we normally see day to day that's invisible, yet it's there. And if we get the eyes, we're going to begin to see it.
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've done any psychedelics, only because the way the environment changed, and I finally, it kind of culminated when I got some very strange stuff and did a 3-month trip. And after 3 months, it took me 3 months to come out of it. And I don't know what it was to this day. It wasn't normal psychedelics though. And I think it might've been, the rumor was going around that stuff was being put out on the street. Nixon had come to office and he basically launched the drug war.
Right.
And, not long after that is when all this shit began showing up on the streets and people started having bad trips and all of that. And that was pretty much when I stopped. I felt like I was just at the beginning of realizing that there was this other dimension and use of these substances.
Right.
But at that point, the whole milieu changed and I backed off because I didn't want a repetition of this ordeal that I had been through.
Right.
So, it took me, that would have been, late summer, early fall of 1969. And I really didn't feel like it was back to normal again till summer of 70. And what I did was I went out and I spent the whole summer out in the Black Hills of South Dakota, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, drinking this incredible spring water, and just basically cleaning out, purifying myself, learning how to meditate, studying spiritual literature. I mean, I spent 6 weeks up in a lean-to on a mountaintop with the Tao Te Ching and several other ancient scriptures, just studying that, thinking about stuff, what I'd been through. And then I lucked out and was able to actually encounter what I consider some bona fide spiritual teachers who showed me some things that confirmed to me that, yes, there are ways to experience some of these things without actually even ingesting drugs,
Yeah, now you're in my ballpark.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but then, things change. I decided at some point that, I needed to figure out a way to make a living legally. So
unlike the government,
I fell back on what I had learned. My father was a master carpenter, house builder. His dad was. So I had come up in that without any particular interest in becoming one myself. But then I decided it was around 72, I needed a job. And I was with this spiritual group. We were studying under a Brahmin priest who was a Sanskrit professor at the University of Minnesota. And he was a student of a Himalayan Swami that had basically grown up at 18,000 feet in a cave in the Himalayas. And he came with this whole tradition of tantric meditation and yoga. And so I got really fascinated by that, began studying it. And then we bought land up in northern Minnesota, and one of the architects in the group designed 2 Buckminster Fuller domes. Remember Buckminster Fuller?
Sure.
Yeah, good. Okay, so Buckminster Fuller was the kind of the godfather of the geodesic dome that
sure
all of the hippies back then wanted to live in a geodesic dome, right? Until they discovered that they leaked like hell and every time the water would be pouring in on them. So although I will say this, there may be a place for them now because our technologies have advanced so much that there are now materials that we could potentially cover these domes with that they wouldn't leak. But
oh yeah, get Apple to manufacture one of those suckers.
Yeah. Well, anyways, so we built 2 domes up in the North Woods of Minnesota, and I had to figure out all the geometry and everything in there and how to make them fit together. And that's kind of where I go, this is really fun, interesting stuff. And I love geometry. And so what happened was is it led me into the building trades, and I thought, well, I'll do my own thing, and which I did, and then in my spare time, I'll just study and research all the stuff that I love to do.
Right.
So that basically goes back, to 70, 71, 72, right in there. And I remember for my 18th birthday, which was in March of 1969, I kept a journal, and I still have that journal, and I wrote in there, one of my goals in life is to become one of the most educated individuals of my generation. And I wrote that right around my 18th birthday.
Wow.
So I kind of set out on this quest and part of it was to learn what I felt was the most significant and important stuff that my generation needed to know to go to take the human race forward. So that was kind of my motivation and my incentive and the vision that I had back in 1969. And I'm still pretty much holding to that as much as possible.
Right.
And now I'm kind of at the point where I'm suddenly realizing, like I said, I've labored in obscurity, and I am overwhelmed at this point with the response that my stuff has been getting in the last couple of years, particularly since Joe Rogan. The last I heard, which was a year ago, the debate with Shermer and Hancock had like 10 or 12 million views, and maybe double that now,
Right.
I'll tell you what I see coming out of this is, one of the things that's inspired me is, when I go back to the ancient teachers, Plato and Pythagoras and those kind of guys, they had places, there was the Socratic Forum, the Pythagorean lodges, the Platonic academies, these were places where you could come to learn and digest information, because they were like clearinghouses of all of the knowledge of that time. Right. And when you look at what's happened with modern academia and in the modern college campus, it's just degenerated into this pathetic, political correct crap.
Yeah.
It's almost saying, look, we need a new format here.
Yeah.
We need a new way of approaching this stuff, with an open mind, but scientifically, and linking together the best of what modern science is yielding with what we've inherited, this amazing legacy from our past that has generally been neglected. There's no place where you can bring these streams together where they can evolve into this mighty river. And that's what I would like to, if I've got 2 or 3 decades left, which I hope I do, that's what I would like to work towards. And continuing to get people out, because listen, there is a story that's been engraved into this planetary landscape. It's been there basically invisible for 12,000 years because we have not had the perceptual capabilities to see it. But we are now in that position, ever since it started with satellite, with aerial photography, and then it moved up to satellite photography. And now we've got LiDAR coming online. We've got all of these new technologies where we can now suddenly see Earth in a way that we've never had before and realize what our ancestors knew well, which is that there is this connection between the terrestrial realm and the celestial. And why were our ancestors so obsessed with the celestial realm? It's because we're seeing this now that we are not an isolated system. Our planet has been part of a cosmic environment since day one. And our ancestors knew this. And this is one reason they were so obsessed with observing the sky and changes in the sky. See, what we need is a place where seekers from all over the world can actually come together and share this kind of information, in a very rigorous way, in a scientifically rigorous way, but in a way that now recognizes, no, we're not supreme necessarily. We have this legacy of lost civilizations. And one of the reasons people like Michael Shermer and other skeptics have been so dismissive is because they say, well, where is the potsherds? Where is the evidence, the hard evidence that there was a civilization?
Right.
We'll save this for another conversation. But what I suspect is that we're looking at, and the evidence for this now again is pretty much overwhelming. There were cultures in the past that were way more scientifically sophisticated than they've been given credit for.
Right.
And they perhaps developed technological based civilizations that don't look anything like the one we have created, which is basically built upon fossil fuels, right?
Right.
And there's enough evidence and enough lines of inquiry over, say, the last century that I think points in the direction of what kind of technologies they were exploring. And the poster right above Ben there, Tesla is my homeboy. I think Tesla was on to things, he was in effect rediscovering things that were already known thousands of years ago.
You know, that's an amazing point. And I shared it with the guys here at lunch that we were talking earlier, that, you know, if there was an advanced society with a better understanding of science than we have today, you know, our nervous system is a basic comparator, and it always compares two things. And it's like when you wake up in the middle of the night and you don't smell the gas versus when you smell the gas, your nervous system will show you the difference in between the two, and it'll wake you up and say, hey, dummy, wake up because this gas is going to kill you. And then you walk around the house for 10 minutes, and between time 1 and time 2, the gas is high and remains high, and so your nervous system stops telling you about that smell, and you don't smell it anymore. You think it was a dream. You go to bed, and it kills the whole family. Well, I think if we had a higher level of understanding in the past of science and our universe, a lot of our discovery that always comes from our subconscious, by the way, and even Einstein supported this idea that, you know, when you have a problem, you think about it for a while, but you're never the one that solves it. It's always that thing that comes from your subconscious, that it comes from your body, that all of a sudden you have the answer that presents itself within your consciousness. It comes from your level of subconscious that knows more about something that you're trying to fix than you do. I think if we had that knowledge, that may be the drive of our human discovery process of increasing our technology. And the reason that we've went from the Wright brothers to the moon in 66 years is because we've already known some of this potentially. We've already fixed and discovered a lot of this science already, and our nervous systems are simply kind of evoking it from having it within us to be able to try to create that equilibrium, to balance that difference between the one thing that it knows and the stupid person on top that's trying to figure it out. And it gives us the answers in a fashion that we can then work with from a time-based perspective. What do you think?
I like it. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, yeah, you're putting the frosting on the cake with that. I think. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we're in a position where there's major shifts in consciousness taking place. I think that, you know, there was a major shift that occurred in the 60s. And subsequent to that, you know, we've been in this state of ferment and things have come and gone. And we're kind of in a state now where we really need to have a relaunch of some of those things that got started. And we're, you know, again, I get back to this thing that we're just getting suffocated in trivia, and mainstream media is largely to blame, you know, by just constantly putting this crap out there that does nothing but distract people. But there is certainly a growing contingent of people that are seeing through that and are asking questions. And it's gratifying to me to see the response that myself and Graham and others have gotten who are doing this kind of work. That there's a lot of people, particularly young people, who are hungry for this kind of knowledge and know instinctively that there's a much deeper story here. And those are the ones we need to reach out to. And I see basically, you know, I'm getting communications from all over the world now. People saying, yeah, we're looking at stuff over here in Sweden now. I'm looking at stuff in my backyard in Sweden with new eyes because of what I saw you do, you know. That kind of thing is very gratifying to me. And I think that we're looking at something here that transcends, you know, the nation state, because, you know, one small asteroid hitting the planet is going to quickly show us that we're all in the same boat here. And this may be the trigger it's going to take, you know, I mean, just every month now we're seeing near misses. And the question that I keep asking is it because we have the technological means to see these things that have been flying by the Earth with regularity, or is the flux of these things actually increasing? Which really has
a tough question.
Yeah, that is a tough question.
Yeah, it is a tough question. But whatever the answer to the question is, we're realizing that our near cosmic neighborhood is filled with this debris. And I've used the analogy before. We're like sitting ducks in a cosmic shooting gallery. And, another repeat of the events of June 30th, 1908, if you're familiar with that.
Tunguska?
Tunguska, yeah. Tunguska. And there is a hell of a story, which we could devote some time to if you wanted to, because we've only just really, spent the last 50 or 60 years extracting those lessons, and it has a lot to teach us. But I can tell you this, if we had a repeat of that now, it would be a game changer.
Yeah.
Especially if it...
Yeah. I'm just thinking that type of an event helps you shift your sense of self, and I think that's what your work is doing en masse. Is it helps us to look at ourselves as a human race rather than a group of cultures or a country that is divided by walls and borders and barriers and mindset and political systems and things like that. I mean, all that stuff doesn't really matter when you start taking into consideration potential extinction events that could take us out if we don't implement the technology that could, circumvent those. And, the nervous system en masse, right? All of our emotional responses come from two simple variables. Your limbic system always scans your environment for threats, right? And it's always looking for a threat. Is that a snake? Is that coil over there a snake, or is that a hose, right? Or is this person a threat? Is this headline a threat? Is this what this person represents a threat, or is this ideology a threat? Well, then a second question must be asked: a threat to what? And that what is the sense of self. It is because your brain's that organ of survival that's designed to bring you from one day into the next. And this is where the people who are attached to their dogmatic science go off the rails, is because that sense of self starts as your body. But science, with Jim Cohn at UVA, he showed that other people can get written onto your sense of self, which is why we have emotions for our family members or our friends or our SEAL teammates or whatever it is for these guys on the couches. But that expands. Our sense of self that used to be just our body expands out into the people that we know. And then Tiffany Burnett White at UAUC said or showed us that how brands can become mapped onto the sense of self, and how we care about Apple or Android or Ford or Chevy or whatever it is, the Dallas Cowboys or the New York Knicks or whatever it is that we attach to self. And that's why we have emotional reactions connected with those things that we want to defend. And then Sam Harris did some studies that proved that politics and religion become mapped onto our sense of self, which is why we get all up in arms when people attack our politics or our religion, etc. And it's this exact same wiring based on this malleable sense of self that we have in our human heads. And I think your work helps us shift our sense of self to not care about the little shit as much when we start to expand our sense of awe in these amazing pictures that you show us and the amazing stories that you're telling us that we almost got wiped out about 12,000 years ago. And if we aren't careful, we're going to let it happen for real next time if we don't take some steps to be able to mitigate these celestial bodies coming into Earth, because it's within our technological capability to do so, and it could literally save all of our skins, regardless of what our individual differences are in religion or politics or our belief systems or our monetary systems, castes, whatever you want to call it. And I think that your work is helping us get over the little shit. You know what I'm saying? And I really appreciate it.
Well, I would like to think so. I mean, I hope there's a reason I've been doing this for 50 years. Some outcome here that. Well, but actually, for me, it's fun. I couldn't not do it. I just, it's an obsession with me. I admit, I just get so engrossed in this stuff sometimes that it's just, I want to. And, I've got a business, and I often have thought to myself and have said to my wife, look, if I just put all this time that I've been doing this research and everything on my business, we'd be millionaires now. But, I've traded one kind of wealth for another kind of wealth. And I'm at the point where I do believe, though, that the resources are very close to happening where this could get kicked to the next level. Because look what we're doing here. Where are you guys, by the way?
We're just up in Charlotte. You know what? You know what's funny is this guy.
I live like 10 minutes from you.
you have a personal Navy SEAL on beck and call that's 10 minutes from your door if you ever need him.
I live off Memorial at Boulevard.
No shit.
Yeah.
So there you
We're
go.
almost neighbors.
Yeah, I live right across from Grindhouse Burgers, like literally across the street.
Okay. I avoid Atlanta whenever possible, but
Yeah, me too, and I live there.
but I'm in Decatur, yeah, near Avondale. If you know
Yeah.
Avondale Estates, yeah.
Yeah, I
very
just moved
close
from
to
there.
it. Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How bizarre.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, so we'll definitely pick this conversation up soon, probably in the next couple of months, just to give you a practice to go on Rogan for next time. Holy cow, that's amazing that you're doing that again. But thank you so much for spending your time today. And yeah, we're interested in hearing more and getting into this and getting into the weeds with you because, we're big fans of your work. We're big fans of, poking our fingers at the status quo simply for the fun of them, flinching. But when there's evidence, behind it that supports our argument, and then that argument is going to help humanity as a whole because it'll give us a bigger picture over our entire existence and our origin story, and maybe give a frame of reference to the folks who are willing to kill over these religious stories that they're wrapping their lives around, to say, hey, there's more of a history than just a few thousand years ago, and you need to understand what that is so you can put your entire existence into context. We're big fans of. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Hey, I've enjoyed every minute of it. I look forward to doing it again.
Awesome. Have a great remainder of your day. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click the bell icon for more awesome stuff. And we're going to have additional episodes with Randall coming up in the future, and we may even take a trip with him. Who knows? Thanks for tuning in. Talk to you guys soon. Peace. And by the way, since you clicked us, go ahead and hit like, hit subscribe, and click that bell icon. You know you want to.